Welcome to the Dev Launch Podcast, bringing you insights from industry experts on how to grow the digital agency you love. Today, we're diving into the game-changing concept of Sprint Zero with Dave Renz from Tanooki Labs. Dave shares how his team is using Sprint Zero to define strategy, design, and development up front, saving time, money, and headaches down the road. If you're a dev shop looking for ideas on how to better qualify software builds, this episode will show you how Sprint Zero can set your projects up for success. Well, hey, Daves, thank you so much for taking some time to talk today on the Dev Launch Podcast. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Really excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, even before we dive into some of the questions, I think the thing that was going through my mind as I was doing a little bit of research on your dev agency is Tanooki Labs. Is that like a callback to like a Mario Brothers type thing, or did I get that right?
I love when people get it because it shows their nerdy nature too. Yes, you're absolutely right. So the name of Tanooki Labs, and I really hope no one from Nintendo is listening right now, but was inspired by Eric and I's, my business partner and I's, one of our favorite video games. Well, like we like to say, the best video game on the best system of all time, the Super Mario Brothers 3. There's this little raccoon character guy that you can get. It's called the Tanooki suit, and that was the inspiration for our little power up here.
Oh, I'm glad that you said that it was like one of the best ones, because I actually happen to think that like it might be like just below maybe anything with like Yoshi's Island, because that was my big thing as a kid. Yoshi's Island, so good. But I would agree. It's a very, very good Mario Bros.
We see eye to eye on that one.
Yeah, it's good. It's good stuff. Well, Dave, I want to dive into it because I think we've got a lot of really interesting things to talk about, especially you guys being a dev agency. I know most of my listeners that are out there are also dev agency owners, and there's just some interesting things you guys are doing at Tanooki Labs that I think would be maybe just helpful perspective to hear. The first thing I want to do is maybe address an integration that you guys have with your approach for doing development. So a lot of dev agencies I talk with, they're specialists, they're experts in, maybe it's a particular coding language or building specific types of apps. But you guys kind of take a pretty holistic approach in your dev agency. You got integrated design, product management, and development all into one full service offering. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about how this holistic approach has evolved over time?
Sure. So this may have initially started actually because of the fact that my business partner, Eric, and I had, prior to starting Tanooki, been part of a product incubator inside of AOL Ventures a number of years ago. And one of our shtick there was was creating a really quick turn between coming up with ideas, designing them, building them, and putting them out into the world. And in that world that we were living in, which was like a 10, 12 week kind of cycle for a number of years, product, design, development were all very highly integrated. And so not having having them be disconnected from one another creates friction. Early on, when we left AOL and we started Tanooki, we started off doing primarily development. Was our focus, and as we were both engineers by background, a lot of the folks that were working for us were engineers. So that was our focus. However, one of the things that we realized very quickly was that while we were being paid for development work, we were doing product strategy and product management work basically for free at the very beginning of it, primarily because unless the product was well thought through, the development project was harder. And so we found ourselves kind of just doing that, because it was part of our skill sets, Eric and I's, but also because it was needed to have good outcomes on projects. And over time, eventually extended to the design world as well, where we had integrated product and that had smoothed out our process quite a lot. We're mostly working with external design firms or partners that our clients would bring in. And that was fine, but I think there were often cases where that integration and having like the team that has worked together a whole bunch before, and just an understanding of the handoffs and what each other needs at each stage was super useful to us. So we eventually filled out the whole set of product development and design.
Okay. So you kind of, it wasn't necessarily something where at the very beginning you guys were doing this automatically, or like you weren't necessarily like packaging your service this way. It was something you kind of evolved into over time based on like what the needs of your clients were, or like how did you guys officially come to the packaging the way that you guys have it today?
Well, so I think, or many things happen organically, and packaging it in the way that we did happen that way as well to some extent, but it wasn't entirely an accident. So one of the ways that we were trying to look at how do we do this first part of this process, right? We're very focused on doing great development work, right? And then what happens before you get to development was always this uncertainty that created risk later down the line when it came into the development standpoint, right? And so that was one of the motivations why we really focused on doing that. And the other component of it was that there was a period of time when we were doing this and it was effectively for free, right? We were doing this as part of the sales process. As we're working through the conversations in sales to understand, well, what needs to be built so that we can give you an estimate for what that would be, we'd spend a lot of time on that, to be able to give like a reasonable, like clear estimate that we can stand by. It took a lot of time. Depending on where someone was in their process, it might require thinking through who the users are, thinking through what all the specific things that those users need to do. A lot of times people know that when they would come in, but not always. And more it was happening where there was needing help refining into what those. So it got to be a point where we might spend like a week or two with somebody just to build an estimate. And we realized at some point or another that this is strategy and that we should be finding ways to incorporate this as something that we could charge for, because we're delivering a lot of value in that stage of the process. And it really came down to, and one of the things that we have historically had challenged, I don't know if it's our style or what it is, but selling strategy or selling a deck is hard when someone comes to you looking for a tangible outcome. So the transition, it was an awkward transition, I would say, like at least initially, until we learned how to talk about it and how to, and like felt comfortable and how it fit into what we do. But it really started out, I think, a lot of that way. It was like finding a way for us to take some of the strategy work, the product strategy work that we were doing, and incorporating that into a process so that we could, get compensated for the value that we were providing, but also sustain doing it, right? Because I think at the end of the day, as we got bigger and bigger, it was harder and harder to do that. But at the end, it also created better products at the end of the day too.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad that you said that piece of the kind of the awkwardness of people come to you for a product or some type of tangible thing, software development, and it's kind of an awkward transition to make to then say, I know what you're saying is you want an application, but what you really probably need right now is some type of, kind of call it some type of design sprint or some type of strategy session. If you feel comfortable sharing, like how do you even navigate that situation? Again, somebody's coming to you, they think that they know what they want. They think that they know they need something tangible, something software being created. How do you then pivot that conversation in a healthy way to help them to realize what they really need is a strategy session?
One of the things that we did that helped with this quite a bit, I think, was we named it. We just gave it a name. We called this our Sprint Zero process. And when we used to say to someone in that sales process, we need to spend some time working through some of these details with you, and we would charge you some money on some package or something to do that in an ad hoc way. That was awkward. But as soon as we said to ourselves, it took us a little while to understand exactly like what do we need to get out of this period of time with someone, and before we start doing the development, how can we structure that? And we eventually came down to calling it our Sprint Zero process, which is a holistic product strategy and design process that we do ahead of actually doing the development. Really helps get through like when you can lead someone down a path, they feel comfortable going on that path with you because it is a path. And by naming something, it gives it some credibility, and you can define it more clearly, right? We have
Mm.
steps to our Sprint Zero process. It will take roughly this amount of time. This is what you can expect at the end of it. This is how it leads into the development phase.
Mm.
So it really, it really a good skeleton for us to hang the rest of this, the meat on the bones, I guess, here as the product went forward.
Yeah. So it's creating those clear lines. It's like you said, naming it. There's a big power in creating your own name for something, and it sounds like by just giving it that structure, it was easier to facilitate those conversations. Is that right?
Totally. Yeah. And it also was helpful in terms of marketing it. We could,
Mm.
when we have our proposal that we send to somebody, there's the Sprint Zero process, and here's what it entails. It's something we can talk about. It's also something that we were able to use when someone, in the cases where someone came to us and said, we want to do this thing. We know that we need to raise money, or there's some milestone in between, here and when we can start doing development. But there's a lot of work we want to do before that we actually get to that phase, right? So the Sprint Zero process enables us to say, that's great that you want to build this eventually, but you can't go through all the process right now. What we can do instead is maybe start with a Sprint Zero, where we help you define or refine some of the details that you're going to need to help you achieve the next milestone before you're ready to start doing development. A lot of cases that's fundraising, or maybe it's user testing, saying that we want to get to a place where we have a pretty good click through design of what this will look like, or a really good use of funds and product roadmap that we can take to an investor, and feel comfortable with that being the right number that we're asking for. And as opposed to just saying like, sorry, come back when you're ready to doing development, right? Like, and so so that creating that space between, the big development project and what could be a couple stages maybe of pre-work that need to enable that is just very helpful.
Yeah. Well, so I know that there's your guys' package is essentially kind of a three part, right? So there's the design piece, there's the development piece, but there's also the product management. I think that was another thing you kind of called out about your guys' kind of integrated approach. Would you mind sharing? Because I think that's the thing that I find to be very unique. Right? Like I mentioned at the very beginning of the show, software development is a very obviously like kind of the bread and butter for software dev shops. The design piece is like, if you're lucky, you might have a design oriented person, or maybe one of the owners themselves is design oriented. And so you got this nice marriage of design and development, but to then also incorporate product management, or like a product mindset about what you're creating or what you're developing. Would you mind sharing about, like, I guess first of all, like what's entailed in product management, and then like, yeah, maybe we'll just start there. Like what's entailed in product management with your services?
That's one it's an interesting conversation with clients, because sometimes the client is the product manager of the project, and they're like, well, we already do that clearly. So why are we going to need this person involved in the process, or why do we need this part of your service? And for us, I think the product management piece is actually a little, at the front end. It's a little strategy. There's product strategy in the Sprint Zero design phase process, and then on an ongoing basis, once we get into the development process, our team at that stage, we tend to work in what we call pods, little Tanooki product pods. So those are, so giving things names, right? Like that's kind of the second stage. And at that point, we have one or more developers in the project. Myself or one of my partners is involved. And then there's this gap of, well, who keeps that train running, right? Like, who writes the user stories? Who does the QA as the devs are working through it? Who sends invoices or reports around things? Make sure meetings are scheduled, planned, and ready, leads those all the times. And that's oftentimes like a product management type role. if we think about the startup world, that's often a role that that person is playing. In our case, it's a little bit more of a call it like a technical project manager, where
Mm.
like maybe the client is more doing things like talking to every customer they can find, working through the business model, or trying to really prioritize what's the vision coming forward, and what's some of the business strategy, and interacting with the internal team and getting some of those requirements that are easier for them to get. On our side, though, because our product managers, are integrated with our team, they are our team, and have such consistent interfaces with the developers, it's a very efficient process where they know each other really well. Everyone's really aware of the process. Everyone knows what the role of the PM is going to be and what they're going to do in terms of writing those user stories, or making sure everything is queued up for our iteration planning meeting at the beginning of the week, or making sure that we have a good demo scheduled and planned for the end of the sprint. And so in our case, there's a lot of, just work that's not development work,
Mm.
that if you push on to the developers, you're kind of wasting their time, right? These folks are really great at turning, a user story into code and feature.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, if you don't have that product manager role involved, people end up throwing things over the wall to the devs and saying like, hey, here's that user story. It could be a little more fleshed out, but is this
Mm-hmm.
good enough for you to get going? And then they say, sure, I guess. And then you end up figuring it out in back and forth in QA, right? Oh,
Mm-hmm.
there wasn't a thing here, or that didn't work that way. And the dev's like, well, that was my guess.
Mm-hmm.
And what we try to do through the role of the product manager is be more specific about that up front, so, and have that as a conversation that we can have with the product owner on the client side, or whatever stakeholder, before it gets to the developer, so that at that point
Yeah.
it's decided. They might
Yeah.
have some good feedback for us on how that decision was made or how it might be done better, but at least the starting point for it is well considered.
Yeah. And so it sounds like it's like a little bit of a combination of like a business analyst, project manager type of function. What would you say to somebody who would come back to you and say, all right, Dave, that sounds great and all, but like we just want to hire senior devs who are capable of being able to not only execute on their user stories, but also be able to have the kind of conversations with their clients where they themselves are actually writing the user stories. What would you say to a person who says that?
I'd say great, have a great time finding that person, because that's a very difficult role to
Yeah.
to find somebody that can. And there certainly are those people out there, right? Like, and they maybe work in a little bit more of a call it like a freelancer capacity, or an individual consultant,
Yes.
like more of a staff augmentation, maybe even sort of way of thinking about it. We don't work that way so much. Like we really focus on working as a pod of people, and primarily for that reason that I mentioned earlier, right? Like having developers be like writing their own stories and doing all that project management work themselves. It's just really inefficient for someone whose hourly is pretty expensive, right? And who can contribute a lot of value in other ways that other people can't contribute. Again, if you know that person, I think that's great. And if that some people love working that way or are super efficient at it. Our experience is that those people are either rare or not as efficient at it as they think that they are,
Mm-hmm.
because it's really hard to wear both of those hats just for
Well,
anybody.
and fundamentally, it's a different type of skill set. One person would argue, well, it's nice to have that in one brain because then you don't lose as much in translation. But I think to your point, these people are incredibly rare. I was actually just having a conversation. The previous guest, podcast guest, I think the episode that's airing just prior to this one, we were talking about this. It's like if you are able to find this person, chances are, like you said, they're either freelancers and they charge an arm and a leg, or they've probably also started their own software dev agency, if we're being totally honest. Because if you have that
Mhm.
type of skill set that's capable of doing the code and translating what a vision that's cast by the client into code, you're probably leading the ship in a different way. You might not necessarily be an employee doing that in somebody else's dev shop. So.
Totally. And that also kind of dovetails a little bit with one of the ways that we frame ourselves to like our startup clients, is we think of ourselves in that world as a technical co-founder for hire.
Hmm.
And it's somewhat of our tagline, I guess. But the reason we say that, and the reason that that technical co-founder thing resonates with what you're saying there is we like to try to take all of the responsibilities and just package it in a way we understand. Particularly on the call it the early stage side of companies, you end up having folks that are they know one word because that's what their advisors tell them. It's like, I need a technical co-founder. And this person is going to do 15 different things for me. They're going to be that product person who's going to like help me think through all of the features and the vision that we've got. They're probably going to organize a lot of their own work. They are going to do the code and they're going to write it in a way that's fast and good enough that it can be grown into the future without a ton of bugs and things and all done kind of at once. And so, in the same way that the reason this resonates with me is this is also a very rare person, this technical co-founder, that if someone has that broad skill set, they're probably very expensive, probably either have their own company already, or maybe they're in between things and, they're looking for their next, and maybe you'll be lucky enough to, encroach them, to bring them on board your team. But I think it's just actually in reality a pretty hard thing to do. So we try to like take a step back and say, well, what is the goal that any of these companies, anyone is trying to accomplish? What are the real responsibilities? And if it doesn't rely all on one person, because that's just a hard thing practically to do, well, how can we make sure that the outcomes are there and those responsibilities that needed to exist were fulfilled? But maybe it doesn't exist all in one person. Maybe it does exist in a lead engineer, a product manager, and in our world, we call it like a CTO role, where we have a little bit more oversight role, but fill some of those, check some of those boxes as well.
One thing I really appreciate about your use of the word or the kind of the category of product management as opposed to project management is I think product management is a little bit more elevated. You're thinking about things more holistically, where a project manager is really there to kind of execute. There's a little bit more execution orientation, where product manager is a little bit more strategic. They do play a little bit in the project management space, but there's something, they're keeping the big picture a lot more in mind. Was that your intent when you framed it that way?
Yes, it was. It's definitely, we need everybody on the team to be thinking about the big picture. And that includes the developers as well. And the way that they think about those things maybe happens slightly differently. But from the product manager perspective in our world, it's very important because that person in our world is both creating the user stories, and we use Linear as the project management tracking tool we use. But they're doing that. They're creating the other documentation and some of the other things. They're interfacing with the design team and this. And if that person doesn't have holistic perspective of what we're trying to accomplish, then each one of those interactions is less efficient, right? And then you just end up with somebody, call it like a partner type person who has to be more involved, which is more expensive, and from the company perspective, less scalable, right? It'd be like, it allows the partners to have less time to work on the business and keeps them working in the business.
Yeah, that is really good. Yeah, I mean, and reality is, like, Dave, I'm going to venture a guess, you probably didn't start Tanooki Labs because you're like, I just want to work 80 hours a week every week for the rest of my life.
That wasn't my goal. Maybe for a few years, hopefully we're good. But no, it's true. And one of the things we focus a lot on is having so Tanooki Labs is a 35-hour a week shop, right? So we truly, really are. I mean, for myself and my business partner, that's kind of not entirely true. But for most everybody else, I mean, it really is. Like, we're not grinding people out, and even me and my partner, we work a decent amount, but we're not doing 100-hour weeks all the time. And part of the reason for that is because we have always focused on trying to like not drive ourselves crazy and give ourselves space to like do good work and not just always feel like we're hustling on details. And so we've invested a lot in having people over the years be our like operations type person to help take some of that off of our plate, and some of our sales and biz dev stuff and taking some of that off of our plate. And it's the same thing with this product manager role. These were things that, as the agency owners, the partners, we were like in the details and having to do all that stuff early on. And it was great because we refined like how we like to do that and what is needed to do that. But at some point we needed to bring some more folks in to like actually help just like get through it all. And that person has to have some, has to be intelligent when doing it too. In the way they
do it. Totally. Well, and this is totally off script, so I apologize. I'm just going to go after this, but
Let's do it.
I'm thinking about this right now because I actually have a client right now who is in the process of hiring somebody who essentially fits the description of what you are talking about here. They're framing it slightly different. The way that they're architecting the position is a little bit different than how you guys are cutting it up, but I'm curious from your because you've now had experience not only hiring but also working with this person or these types of people. What are you looking for in a person that fits this role? Are they previous developers? Do they have no coding background? Like what kind of person are they?
Great question. One of our best product managers, Lauren, was a teacher. She was an art teacher. She also then eventually went on to work at a startup and did kind of something there. But her background was in education, right?
Hmm.
One of our more recent product manager hires was Liz. She was an architect, and so it's not necessarily. I actually think it's a good role that you don't have to have come from a very specific background to do well at.
Hmm.
I think the attributes that we really look for when we're hiring, and the way we hire folks in this case is we'll start with like a just to get to know you interview, and then we ask people to do a little project, and that project is essentially like kind of a fake product idea, and we ask them to break down who the users would be and what the features are, and kind of do some of the real work that we often are doing, and just seeing what someone's thought process is like in how they break problems down and how they organize their thoughts and the thoughts that they're sharing with others. And communication is huge, right? I mean, it's such a communication oriented role.
Hmm.
So I think the things that we, I guess, primarily are looking for is like someone who's a really strong communicator, both verbally and written, and is really organized, and is a clear thinker, right? And then a lot of the other stuff you can help people. And we all use the internet, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's some technical things that you might need to fill in, like what does a server mean, or what are some of the things that our devs are doing on the launch checklist, or how do I interact with that? But those are things you can train people on. But the really key things are those like clear thinking, organization, and just great communicating
Yeah.
and nice people. They also have to be
Oh,
really nice people, I
totally. They've got to be
think.
you have to have a core values fit there. Otherwise it's like what are we doing here? Like what are we really building? So I mean obviously you got two very good success stories here. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, were there any situations when you tried to hire somebody or you brought somebody on for a short period of time and it just didn't work in the product management space?
Yeah, we've had a couple of false starts that I think were we learned from, and I think those kind of values that I just mentioned were, looking back on it, the challenge and the problem, right? Whether it was people's follow up wasn't good and they weren't
Mm.
great with clients in some sense. I think the follow through is like really important, or
Mm.
just again some of the personality and values things that maybe we didn't have as tight back at the time, but it happens. And I think the key to that for us is, and we got some feedback from clients that after one of those people were transitioned out, that the client was pretty uncertain about us at that point because of the person in that role. And
Ooh.
fast forward 5 years later, this is still an active and happy client of ours. But it was interesting feedback to have gotten from somebody that actually, this person was, from our perspective, wasn't a good fit. And so we were glad to see that someone else came onto the project.
Wow. Well, and that just underscores the importance of a role like this. I mean, not to undercut by any means the role that a designer plays, the role that a developer plays. Typically, the feeling of like them not quite meeting snuff or not quite delivering on what they need to be delivering is you're going to run into a buggy product or maybe just some not great feedback from the client. But it's usually going to be something you experience down the road. Whereas a product manager or somebody who's client facing, who is leading a lot of that client interaction, that's going to be felt really quick and could be probably one of the first things that's going to cause you guys to lose out on revenue on the client.
Definitely. It's one of those places where you can gain and lose credibility pretty quickly. And it's part of the reason why it's important that this person is like pretty well organized and like thoughtful, because you can get into a situation where you're asking the same question multiple times, or again, like there was something on our to-do list last week that didn't get done and it happened a couple weeks ago, and it's like, why is that? And the clients will do that. It's just reality, right? But when we're doing that, or when someone on our team is doing that, and like that product manager person is not keyed in on it, well, then that just means there's more that the partners have to do to make sure that things are moving along smoothly. And when when your eye's not on the ball for that, when you're expecting someone to do it right, yeah, well, it can end up being like a pretty bad experience for somebody when they're paying a lot of money for the service that they're receiving, right? And so
Hmm.
like having like great return of value for what people are paying, and like feeling that is really really important.
Oh yeah. I mean, you think about it, it's like the like you're saying, the kind of the value that is perceived, the value that's being received before you actually get a working product is the client experience, really. And it's like if you feel really confident that the person who's leading the charge here, the product manager who's leading the charge here, if you feel really confident and you're getting routine communications, you're going to feel, even if you haven't gotten a product yet, you're going to feel the value because of how they hold you through the experience. So that's actually a really, really good point to make.
Yeah, I mean, development is our bread and butter. It's where most of our revenue comes from, but it is totally enabled by strong product management in a way that I I mean, like there are probably other ways of doing it, but it's a role that I think needs to get filled somehow,
Hmm.
and it's really important for us to have it done this way.
Yeah. So I'm going to pull on a thread you mentioned earlier, which is to say that sometimes the needs in product management are a little bit different depending on the type of client you're working with. And from conversations you and I had before, I know that Tanooki Labs has maybe it's somewhere in the ballpark of like 50-50 or 60-40 or something like that, where you've got a number of kind of more startups, companies that are looking to raise rounds. And so they're engaging you as their technical co-founders for hire. But then you also do some work with existing businesses. Maybe it's I have a business and I just want to up my game by establishing a client portal, or I want to enhance an existing application or something to that effect. So slightly different customers. What role do you see product management playing? And like, how does it differ between those two types of clientele? Or are they basically the same in terms of how you interact with them?
I would love to say that they're fairly similar, and I think that is generally the case because we focus on doing things as a team that comes in to do stuff. We're not doing like staff augmentation where we drop a developer in to a company, or we drop a designer into a project, or something like that. It's usually like we're running a process. We're doing and at the end of it, there's some outcome and whatever, and there's a couple people involved. It doesn't necessarily mean it's more expensive than if one person was doing it. It just means that like we have individuals that are better at certain aspects of what need to be done, or more efficient at that than if I just had the designer do all of it, or the developer do all of it, or the PM do all like having some combination of people is more efficient in our belief. And when it comes to so if it's a big company or a small company, we're focusing on doing product development, largely speaking, and then iterating on that. And so that process is a lot of the same. We use our Sprint Zero process as we draw people, either one of those folks through. We use our typical pod development process as we're continuing to manage things over time. If there's a notable role that we do not have at our company is an account manager. And that is something you see at agencies as they get bigger, I think. We have avoided having someone in that role, because we're not that big. We're only 30 people. It's enough that we can manage the way we are. But that is still something that needs to be done in some sense. And so part of that role falls on whoever the partner is that's kind of working with that company. But a lot of that also falls on the product manager to be, to have good vibes, I guess, if you will, with that client. Be checking in, and a lot of our like quarterly check-ins that we do with people, and those things we orchestrate through the product manager because they have a lot of the context in that project. And on a bigger company, those things become a little bit maybe more important, where there's like multiple stakeholders that we're trying to wrangle, or
Sure.
When it's a smaller company, people work on our process. When it's a bigger company, we work on their process, and that could be from a billing standpoint, or from like how we do how the other teams that are at the company kind of interact with each other. So there is a little bit more that ends up happening in the bigger company
Mm-hmm.
world that I think is just, I don't want to call it rote, but it's there's more overhead to managing a bigger company client, and some
Mm-hmm.
of that does fall on the product manager.
Yeah, and I imagine when you're thinking about the new product, right? Because you said that typically Tanooki Labs is engaged to kind of create net new items, usually not coming in to fix an existing thing or upgrade an existing thing. And so, with that net new, would you say that working with larger clients or working with established businesses, there's typically a little bit more by way of change management and garnering buy-in than there is for a startup, or is it about the same?
There are, I mean, one of the nice things about working with a startup is often the person who you're talking to is the person who's making the decision. So that makes it easy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always that way with bigger company stuff. That's something we rely a lot on the person at the company we consider a product owner, which maybe they're the decider, maybe they're not, but there's someone who's in a good place to take information and questions back to other stakeholders in the company to then come back and provide the answer to those. So I don't know that it's not necessarily harder, but it is different because those decisions are usually set. Sometimes in the startup world, like things are changing a little bit more often by nature.
Mm-hmm.
So there's pros and cons, I'd say, to either. But it definitely is a little bit more of a process on the bigger company side as to how
Yeah.
decisions get made.
Okay. And I mean, that's been my experience as well. I mean, it's the curse and the blessing about working with larger or more established businesses is on the one hand, there's a lot more financial stability. You're typically going to have maybe a higher LTV in terms of just the longevity of the client. But it can be really hard to navigate all those layers of decision making and, all the buy-in and, some people might even call it red tape, but there's pros and cons for both of those. I think something that I'm interested to get your take on is what we've seen 2023 coming into 2024. Again, this is totally off script, but I'm just so curious as we're talking. Um, I distinctly remember reading the message. I think it was what was that? What's that startup group? Was it Y Combinator? I think who messaged it out where they're just like warning all of the startups, like, hey, we're heading into a recession or things are going to start to dry up in terms of VC funds.
Mm-hmm.
And it's totally been the case from my perspective that VC funds, for the most part, have been a lot harder for startups to come by unless you've got the words artificial intelligence in some of your pitch decks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you being, Tanooki Labs being very much involved in the startup space as you are, and then also having your foot in the world of existing established businesses, what can you tell me about what you guys have seen from an economic perspective over the last year and a half as all this stuff has unfolded?
I would totally share what you just said about how it does seem like the access to capital that startups have is less than it was certainly during the boom of whatever 22 was pandemic style. But even before, maybe the numbers on net have come similar to what they used to be. But like I think your point about having a credible AI narrative as requisite to getting in that number is probably pretty realistic. And yeah, I that partially is one of the reasons why our revenue has kind of equalized between bigger and we used to be more smaller company oriented. We're now a little bit more bigger company oriented, but we still do a lot of the other ones. And that's a lot of the reason why. It's just the opportunity. I mean, we've had a number of clients that are really strong. They have good metrics. If you'd rewound the clock 24 months ago, they probably would have raised their money like pretty quickly. But that's not the world that we're living in right now, whether it's interest rates or just opportunities that are out there. But definitely echo that sentiment and hear the same thing from entrepreneurs who are raising all the time.
Yeah. And the role that you guys are playing too in you being that technical co-founder, I imagine that because artificial intelligence probably has to play some role in the pitch deck that's going out to investors. Have you been seeing any maybe like trends or kind of quick wins or easy wins to be able to help those startups get a little bit more of a leg up in terms of securing the funding that they're looking for with the products they're building through you?
I mean, at the end of the day, people want revenue. That's really what they want. I mean, there used to be this period of time. I think maybe you like the store, like there used to be this. I mean, probably still is like this thing where it's like you can either sell a vision or you can sell numbers, and like it's hard to do both, right? Once you have numbers, it's really hard to sell the vision, and stuff like that, because it's like, well, this is where you are now, and I think that another pre-post pandemic sort of thing. Vision was pretty strong before and during, and now I think it's pretty results oriented. And in terms of like revenue, maybe profit, I don't, depending on the size of the company, I suppose. But I don't think it gives people a leg up to willy nilly use the word AI. Similar to I feel like almost everything for a while had a crypto component to it, right? And to me, that almost lost credibility when someone was like, hey, we're going to do the social network for something, and there's going to be a token involved. And it's like, I like the social network part because that's a community that's underserved. The token part makes no sense to me because these people don't know what a token is. So why is that going to change the game? And same for the AI stuff, right? Where I think there are clearly a bunch of new opportunities that have opened in terms of what startups can pursue in terms of viable businesses because of AI, or making existing or products like significantly better by incorporating some AI. But I don't think there's like again, there's all these trends, right? Like one that happened a long time ago was the swipe. Everything was a swipe interface, and that was like going to be like when Tinder or whatever. This was a long time ago, but it was stuff like that, right? And I actually think that like it's more about how can the leg up, I would say, is like actually articulating your fundamentals extremely well. That's the leg up, right? Being like this is why this is a good investment for you, and here's how we're going to get from there to there. I like using the word AI or renaming it to .ai. I don't know if it adds a lot of value, honestly.
Well, and I would echo that sentiment, especially recently. I think when ChatGPT, was first launched and, people were just going crazy over it, I think at that point there was just kind of his mass hysteria of like, okay, I'm going to throw money at you. Like if you have AI, anything in your pitch deck, because at the time it wasn't oversaturated. But to your point, I think it's so oversaturated, so overused, where in reality, 9 times out of 10, the company that's trying to raise funds for their AI product, they basically just have an API plug into ChatGPT. That's their AI.
That's totally right. I mean, the depth of, I mean, if like again, that's where the credibility I think kind of can be lost, is by saying like we have this amazing AI solution, and someone who maybe has some experience in that space would say, well, you're calling an API in a way that's interesting, but is that a defensible position to be in? That opens up a whole other set of questions.
Yes, that is very, very true. Well, I want to talk a little bit about maybe diving further into the startup world. One thing that I'm keenly aware of, and I know you are too, with startups, is they don't necessarily have all of the money in the world. So they're very budget conscious, probably more so than established businesses. Although established businesses also are pretty budget conscious, but especially startups. They have a limited runway. And so they really need to get done. They need to get a lot done on a very limited budget. And I know that you even mentioned this, that can be a challenge in terms of how you structure your engagements with these startups. So how do you balance providing high quality service while also maintaining those tight budgets?
That is the $64,000 question, I guess, right? We have this blog post that we've done before, but it's also like a well-trotted thing. But you can have things fast, you can have them cheap, or you can have them be good. But you can have pick two. You can't have all three. And so that's an important factor here. Like it's got to be good. That's for sure. Like that's one that has to be chosen. And then it comes up to balancing. I think, what's the speed that we need here, or what's the actual set of features that are going to be needed, and getting really good at helping prioritize what's really important for this and what's not really important for this. And that's a tough one, because people have inherently, like, we think more is better. It's maybe it's American, whatever it is, but like, if you ask a startup founder, if is it better to have this feature or to not have a feature, it's always better to have a feature. And I don't think that's actually true, because some features actually degrade an experience, but they also don't necessarily add anything to an experience. So when you're thinking about the core user journey that your primary user is going through, and whether a feature is important or not, a question I always ask is someone going to pay for this or stop paying for this because this feature does or does not exist? And if the answer is it doesn't matter, well, then it probably doesn't matter that much. And that's not broadly, it's not true for everything. But when it gets down to a hard debate about it, like that I find to be a useful question to ask. It's something we have to be like. So there's the prioritization aspect of it, and then there's also the like we said, it's got to be good. It really does have to be good. And this is the problem that I think a lot of startups like bump into, is that they'll go, you can get good work done offshore. There's also a lot of ways to get not a lot for your money but if you're not managing that well. And so I think that ends up being like one of the levers people try to use to get more for their money. It's like, well, I'll just pay less and then I'll get more for my money. Well, you may get more features, but do all of them work as well as you want them to? Maybe not. And so the balancing act that we try to play is like, okay, well, let's make sure we get the right set of features, because they got to be done really well. And you have a fixed budget to do this in, because like as you pointed out, right, startups, they just don't have another way to get money aside from raising more of it in most cases. So it's really like, it's important for us to do what we say we were going to do. But it's also really important for us for the things that we all decided that we were going to do to have been pretty close to the right things, which is not always a decision that we get to make. Right. And so that ends up being like a really important part of our Sprint Zero process, where we're helping, is this the most important feature? By the way, this is going to cost X thousand more dollars. If that is the most important feature, does that mean it should displace something else, or that should, or we're going to find more money to incorporate it, or how does reality going to come to bear with that? And if you're wrong, and so finding that, and then the final piece of that is, you just got to be willing to make really hard promises and stick to them, right? And if you don't make money doing it, that is just what it is. And I think that's one of the challenges about working with startups is that, like, if you don't finish the job, no one is going to finish the job, and the company will go away. And that's bad. That's really like the exact opposite of what you would want to accomplish from your customers. We take extremely seriously. So, everything that we start, we finish, whether it's painful for us or not. And the way that we reduce the pain on us is we make sure that the prioritization is done really well, and that things are well thought through. Because at the end of the day, we're going to get it done. Whether we can be a profitable business based on that is somewhat based on some of these other things.
Wow. So, I mean, based on that, it sounds like, do you guys fix your bids for at least like the initial work you do with these startups?
A lot of times for the first phase of a project, we'll fix the project. We'll still do it hourly. We'll kind of, for us, it's a way of like getting people kind of used to working on an hourly basis with a bit of a capped downside, right? Where we're taking on some of the risk. It's not to say that if there's changes, we don't do like a change request sort of thing, right? We try to keep pretty close on that because it's good habits. But it is for that first get the product to market with a startup, it's kind of what you're doing anyway. You're kind of saying like, hey, here's the budget that people have got. We're going to do it for that amount of money. So we just acknowledge it as reality. And often that's the way it doesn't happen 100% of the time that we have that arrangement, but it happens, particularly with startups, quite a lot that ends up being what we do.
And maybe it would be helpful for our listeners to hear this too, because I can already hear the shouting inside of their brains, which is like, don't you know that in 18 months or 12 months, like a project, you're not going to know from the very beginning if the project is going to be if even what they need or what the features they think they need are going to be the same at the very end of it. What's the typical duration for this phase one you're talking about?
Well, part of the way that we mitigate that problem is by having our sprint zero process at the beginning of it.
Mm.
So we like what that allows us to do is spend 2, 3, 4, 6, 8 weeks, whatever it is, getting really, 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 really knowledgeable about the specific thing that we're building, doing the actual design for it so that at the end of it, we know what is that screen going to look like? What
Mm-hmm.
are those elements going to be? How does that combo box going to work? Whatever it is. So we know those details up front pretty well
Hmm.
based on that. And that helps us tighten up, what the feature set we're going to be doing is. We also call it time box that as well. Generally speaking, we're looking for something that's going to fit within a 3 to 4 month development window.
Mm.
And part of that is process on our side. Part of that's just reality. It just turns out that budgets and the things people try to do, you can really get done in like 3 or 4 months, almost anything, within some degree, within some view of it, right? And the question is just like how it turns out. And so if we do that called fixed part, it's probably focused on a 3 or 4 month window. And then after that, we go back into our time and materials. We're doing this on an hourly basis where we're keeping you really up to date on each week. You're getting a budget report. We're tracking to the budgets that we're talking about. But we all have to understand that like things over time are variable, and
Right.
that usually resonates.
Well, and I think that's a helpful call out, right? Because again, where many of the dev agency owners I know are just going to be like, I can't believe you would ever fix the bid because we can't possibly know what the feature set's going to be. And some would even argue that 3 to 4 months might be too long of a horizon for us to fix feature lists. But it is helpful for you to clarify that that's part of the reason why you guys have Sprint Zero, is to do a lot more of that work up front. Granted, you're never going to be able to get 100% of all the features that they will want, because I'm sure you've probably gotten to month 2, 3, and 4 where they're like, oh, we totally forgot that we also need this feature, and then you kind of have to say, well, this is what we're working on for phase one. I mean, is that usually how those conversations go?
Well, it always starts with, hey, I mean, it always happens. First of all, you're right. 100% of the times, and that is good, right? That is what we want to happen. That we want to be in a situation where we're learning something that is real and valuable, and then it's getting included. The conversation around that always begins with, well, let's do an estimate for what this would be, right? And like if it's net new, let's take the time and think it through and understand what the real scope is. Because it's very easy to say, oh, that's not that big a deal, let's just throw it on, or oh, that's not that big of a deal. What it turns out, unless you like go through the details of thinking about it, sometimes like, oh yeah, we'll add we're fine adding like I don't know, share functionality somewhere. It's like, well, it turns out that touches 6 different places in the app,
Mm,
and the output of that is going to have to require a different almost user. There's just all kinds of different ways, things that unless you really spend the time meticulously thinking it through, you might end up being surprised at the end of the day. So
mm,
we start with that. We come up with a number and we say, great, it looks like this is going to be X dollars or X days for us to probably do. Does that fit into your budget? And if it doesn't, how can we find places in the budget here that we can squeeze that in? And it's always we always try to like make this a decision that the our client needs to make, right? Like this is
mm.
like it's a lever for them to pull, not for us
Yes,
to pull.
that's good.
And that's why having divorcing, it's part of the challenge with doing a fixed project up front is getting people to feel that. But at some point we all get an intuitive sense of doing something is going to cost more, and so it is up to me to, like, if I want a pizza, I have to be able to buy a pizza.
Mm.
And so if I can't, well, then I can't have it, or I don't do something else, and then I can have a pizza. Whatever it is.
Hmm. There's give and take, and it sounds like the communication piece is really critical in that phase one, so that it's not one of those things where you're waiting to the last minute and then but you're just having an ongoing conversation with them. And like you said, you're not making executive decisions on their behalf, you're informing them, and then let them make the decisions on, like, okay, if you want this and it needs to be here, maybe we can find some other features that can be pushed to phase two, or maybe we can push this feature that you just talked about to phase two or something to that effect. But like, how do you navigate through? Because I'm even just thinking about one situation for one of my clients that they got to the end of a project. It was a 8-9 month project. You got to the very end, and there was just some things where it wasn't entirely clear as to whether they were the ones responsible for that. There's something within the feature itself that wasn't clearly
Mm-hmm.
defined, and it wasn't entirely clear if that was their responsibility based on the way the SOW was drafted, versus if it was something that would be later down the road. Like, do you often face that when you come to near the end of that phase one, where it's like maybe a feature wasn't fully hashed out, and so it's a little bit too much of a gray area, and you kind of have to just eat it?
Yeah, and we do it. We just eat it, and I think that's okay because it does happen. Always happens
Mm-hmm.
at the end of it, like we're launching. It's like there's always stuff that people didn't think about, and rightfully so. It's fine. We learn to if it's of some size or something, well then we're out to talk about it. In the case where you're saying where it's a little uncertain, if it's uncertain, so it depends on the size of it, right? And it depends on the desire to keep working together, which I'm sure is high. I think our default would be to probably just roll with it and say like, okay, it was on us to not be that clear about this. We
Mm-hmm.
will figure out how to incorporate this, and like let's have a strong relationship in the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that those kinds of things you kind of just need to do when you're building a relationship,
Yeah.
because from our standpoint this is going to be a long-term relationship. Like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of our clients are 2+ year long situations
Mm-hmm.
that so the LTV goes well beyond this, although this may be a big chunk of it, but it certainly goes well into the future, and also creates referrals and
Mm-hmm.
and case studies we can talk about, and like there's all kinds of positive things. Even if you don't make a lot of money on the first one, having a really happy client that will continue into the future has a ton of additional value.
Oh, totally. Yeah, absolutely. If you can get a bunch of raving fans who are your existing clients, like, talk about decreasing that customer acquisition cost significantly for all the other ones that are coming in. Totally agree. I think one thing that we haven't touched on yet that I think is worthwhile for us to address as we talk about, honestly, like fixing the bid for phase one, is you guys have taken a pretty specific approach on your tech stack. Because I think this is also an area of great dispute. I know some agencies who are like, we only do Ruby on Rails. We're not anything else. Like, we're a specialist in this one, tech stack or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then other ones are just like, we'll take whatever. Like, we don't care. We'll code in whatever language. But you guys take the approach of really focusing your tech stack across all. I guess, what role does choosing that tech stack and being pretty strict on that play when it comes to having fixed bids for your clients on Sprint Zero and Phase One?
So the reason we have a tech stack preference, so our preference is Ruby on Rails and React Native are probably the three big platforms that we use the most now, and Ruby on Rails probably being the core of that, is because, well, there's a handful of reasons. Like and they all come from the client's perspective. In terms of Ruby on Rails and some of these React ways of doing things as well, are just a really efficient way to get something done. Just from like, can I get this feature from zero to having these features? It's really hard to take a general person, I guess, and like have them get to that point as quickly as you can, in our opinion, with Rails, because there's just a lot that's built in. It has a lot of like great stuff that you're going to do in every project, and it just works. And that's helpful. It's also something our team knows super well, and is very trainable, which I'll get back to. But like, it's something our team knows super well, so they can be really effective at doing those specific things that we do all the time. So that's another reason for specialization, is because we can be more efficient. And then I think that from a client's perspective, additionally, besides just like getting more done for the money, it's also, can I hire people in the future to do this, to take over this thing? Every one of our projects, all of them, the happy ending is we've hired a full-time team to come in and run this into the future. or whatever it is, or transition in some way. And that has to be done in a way that it can be picked up. And so if you use, so if you're, I don't know, using the latest, greatest, you know, like JVM derivative backend thing that everyone really thinks is neat, but there's like no documentation on the internet for. Well, that's an interesting science experiment that might increase the experience of those developers or that company or whatever. But what's it doing for the client to be built on that platform? So we focus on Rails as the backend and React Native also for similar reasons, because there's a ton of great people out there in the world that understand those platforms deeply. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of great resources to get people that aren't in that place yet up to speed. So it actually from a hiring perspective, that's one of the ways that we think about it too. It's like, can they build a team to manage this into the future and make it maintainable? From our standpoint, it's one of the better platforms to enable that.
Yeah. Well, and man, I was listening to some people talk about this. We'll call them software development purists, who they abhor React. Oh, it's too basic. Everybody knows it. But I think the thing we overlook when that's our perspective is that at the end of the day, it's more important. A lot of times, it's more important to our clients, especially if they're in the startup space, that there's to the language or a continuity to the language, mm-hmm. And it's like, there's a reason why so many developers can code in React. And so I think that does play a huge role, I imagine, in being able to mitigate some of the risk of fixed bid, right? Because like if you're doing fixed bid and you don't have a niche and you just code in whatever language, your risk is astronomical. But the second you start to kind of put some Rails in, like Ruby on Rails in, you can start to mitigate some of that. So you don't have as many variances, I'd imagine.
That's totally it. It's aside from all those other things, it's just, because our team knows how to do this really well, I can tell you how long it's going to take to do an onboarding flow pretty precisely. I can tell you how long it's going to take to do file uploads or, I don't know, some other integration. If you pick, I don't know, if you told me to do it in Rust, I don't honestly know how long it would take me to do that. It's probably not that much different, but I don't know what problems I'm going to bump into along the way. And by specializing, and honestly, we like Rails for these reasons. If someone said, hey, we use, Node and Express or whatever the comparable platform over there is, and we know that super, super well and we get stuff done really quickly, great. That's awesome. I think there's totally ways that like, this is not the only platform that this can be done in, but mm-hmm. The tenets of the kind of having known outcomes with known amounts of effort that go into it and be able to maintain it going forward are just the critical things to consider when choosing a platform for that.
So huge. Well, Dave, I really appreciate it. This has been a very, very insightful conversation. A couple twists and turns I wasn't expecting, but you just kind of have to go with the threads based on how the conversation is progressing. I'm going to imagine, though, Dave, as people are listening to this, especially if I'm talking with other software, listening to this and their software development agency owners themselves, they're probably going to have questions, or they're probably going to want to follow up on some of the stuff that we talked about today. What's the best way to follow you, Tanooki Labs, or even get in contact with you if they had some follow-ups?
Yeah, would love that. Our easiest way to get in touch, our website's tanookilabs.com. So, we can reach out there on LinkedIn. I go David Renz, say follow, message me there. I'd love to chat with people. And those are probably the best places, website and LinkedIn.
Awesome. And I would also say follow Dave as well, because you guys are putting out, I'd say, pretty awesome video content. That was actually one of the things that struck me, and that why I reached out to you is I'm like, it's not very often that I see software dev agency owners getting out there. Sometimes I'll meet a dev agency owner who is maybe a non-technical founder, but you're a developer, like you are a very technical individual, and here you guys are, doing some video content. I'm like, this is fantastic. So go take a listen. They've got some really great stuff that they're putting out there too.
Well, I appreciate that, because I share the admiration for what you're up to too, Tony, because I think there's a lot of valuable stuff that you're putting out for dev agencies. I've learned a ton just from after having met you and having watched your stuff. So thanks so much for that.
I appreciate it. Well, Dave, thanks again so much. And I don't know, I think we're probably going to have you on for another episode.
Would love it. I'll come back anytime.
And thank you to our listeners. If you found value in our episode today, please leave us a review and tell your friends about us. If you're interested in being a guest on our show as a digital agency owner, or maybe somebody with insights that can help digital agencies grow, head over to our website to learn more at acquip.com/podcast guest. That's ACCQUIP.com/podcast guest.